In the winter of 1894, in a sod and driftwood house along the Kauwerak River in northwest Alaska, an old man was doing something his people had done for longer than anyone could count. He was telling the winter stories. Outside, the Seward Peninsula lay under a darkness that would not fully lift for months. Inside, in the low light of a seal oil lamp, the elder was passing down the account of the three great disasters, the way it had been passed to him, and to the one before him, and to the one before that. The first was a darkening of the sun that lasted 3 days. The second was a great flood, and the third, the one that had nearly ended his people entirely, was the year the summer did not come. He did not give a date. His people did not measure time that way. He simply said that once, long ago, the warm season never arrived. The snow did not leave, the ground did not thaw, the rivers stayed locked, the animals did not return, and the fish did not run, and the stores that were meant to carry a family from one summer to the next were emptied with no summer waiting on the other side. And when the cold finally broke, only 7 people were still alive. Everyone who came after descended from those 7. The village of Kauwerak itself was built by their children, on the flat bank of the river, at a place the old people had always said was good to stay. It would be almost a full century before anyone outside that house understood that the old man may have been describing, in the plain language of memory, one of the largest volcanic events in the recorded history of the Northern Hemisphere. An event that happened on the other side of the world, in a place his people had never seen and could not have named, and whose smoke a different man, a famous one, was watching darken the sky over Europe in the very same year. How does a people with no written calendar preserve the memory of a single catastrophic summer across who knows how many generations? How do you carry a date you were never given? What does it mean that a story told in a sod house in Alaska and a scientific paper written on the other side of an ocean may be describing the exact same sky? And if the memory is real, what was it actually a memory of? To understand why those questions matter, we have to start with what the researchers expected to find in the tree rings and what they found instead. The people who told this story called themselves the Inupiat, the real people, and the particular community at the center of this account were the Kauwerak, the people of Kauwerak. Their homeland was the central Seward Peninsula, a landscape of tundra and river and long winter dark at the far northwestern edge of the North American continent. For most of the outside world through most of history they were simply not visible. No colonial record followed them closely. No survey mapped their seasons. What they knew about their own past, they kept the way they kept everything that mattered, in the telling and retelling of it, winter after winter, in the Kagi, the communal house where the old stories were spoken aloud. Among those stories was the account of the 3 disasters, and for a long time to the few outsiders who ever heard it, the third disaster sounded like exactly the kind of thing folklore is made of, a summer that simply refused to arrive, a near extinction. 7 survivors, a number clean enough to feel symbolic. It had the shape of a legend, and it was treated as one. But there is a detail inside that legend that does not behave the way a legend is supposed to. It is not grand, it is not heroic, it is agricultural, almost boring. The summer did not come, the snow did not melt. That is not the language of myth. That is the language of a growing season that failed, described by people whose survival depended on reading a growing season correctly. And it is that quiet, specific, unglamorous detail that would eventually catch the attention of scientists who were not looking for legends at all. They were looking at trees. Near the northern tree line of Alaska, in the stunted spruce that cling to the edge of where forests can grow at all, temperature is written into wood. In a place that cold, a tree's growth in any given year is governed almost entirely by the warmth of its summer. A warm summer leaves a fuller, denser ring. A cold summer leaves a thin, starved one. Stack those rings across centuries and you get a record, year by year, of how warm each summer actually was, a climate archive that grows one line at a time and does not exaggerate. In the 1990s, a team of researchers led by the dendrochronologist Gordon Jacoby, working with the anthropologist Karen Workman and the climate scientist Roseanne Dorigo, read that archive for Northwest Alaska. They reconstructed summer temperature back across roughly 400 years, and one year stood out from all the others, a single summer colder than any other in the entire 4-century record. The reconstructed temperature for that summer fell 4 standard deviations below the long-term average, a departure so extreme that in a normal distribution it should almost never happen at all. The year was 1783. That number would have meant nothing on its own, a cold spike in a wooden ledger. But 1783 is not a quiet year in the history of the planet's climate. It is one of the loudest, because in June of that year, on the far side of the world, the Earth had opened. In the remote highlands of Iceland, a fissure called Kauwerak tore open across the land, a row of roughly 140 craters and vents stretching some 17 miles. The eruption that followed, known simply as Laki, was not the tall, explosive kind that throws a single cloud into the sky. It was worse, in a slower way. It bled. For 8 months, from June of 1783 into February of the next year, it poured out the largest lava flow in recorded history, and with it an almost unimaginable volume of sulfuric gases, released not in one burst but continuously, month after month, into the upper air. Those gases did what gases do. They caught the winds of the upper atmosphere and spread. Within weeks the haze had reached Europe. By the 1st of July it was noticed in China. A dry, sulphurous fog settled over much of the northern hemisphere, thin enough to see through but thick enough to change everything it filtered. And this is where the story briefly leaves both the trees and the tundra and arrives at a man most people have heard of, sitting in Paris, watching the sun go strange. In 1783, Benjamin Franklin was in France as the first American ambassador to the country. He was also, all his life, a scientist, and the sky that summer would not let a scientist look away. The following year he set down what he had seen in a short paper delivered to a scientific society, a document titled, with characteristic modesty, Meteorological Imaginations and Conjectures. In it he described a constant fog that summer over all of Europe and a great part of North America. He noted something uncanny about it. The sun's rays passing through this haze were rendered so faint that when gathered in the focus of a burning glass, a magnifying lens that on an ordinary day could set paper alight, they would scarcely kindle brown paper at all. The sun was still there. It had simply been dimmed. And Franklin, reasoning it through, connected that dimming to the cold that followed. The weakened summer sun, he argued, failed to warm the ground. The early frosts came. The first snows fell and did not melt and gathered, and the winter that followed was, in his words, more severe than any that had happened for many years. He even guessed at the cause. Perhaps, he wrote, it was the smoke of some great burning mountain, and among his candidates was a volcano in Iceland. He was not certain. He said so plainly. But sitting in Paris, watching a lens fail to burn paper, Benjamin Franklin had looked up at a dimmed sun and reasoned his way most of the way toward the truth. That summer had been stolen by something far away, something burning, something that had thrown a veil across the light of the sun itself. Now hold those two images together. A famous statesman in Paris, writing carefully in the language of 18th century science, describing a fog that weakened the sun. And an old man in a sod house on the Kauwerak River, generations of memory behind him, describing a summer that never came and a snow that never melted. Different continents, different languages, different worlds, entirely the same sky. This is the point where the story becomes genuinely difficult and where it matters to be careful. Because there is a temptation, once you see the shape of it, to snap the pieces together and declare the case closed. The tree rings say 1783, the volcano says 1783. The oral tradition says the summer did not come. Therefore the story wants to say the Kauwerak were remembering Laki. Therefore the memory is a recording of the eruption. But that is more than the evidence can bear, and honest research says so. The oral tradition, remember, gives no date. It says long ago. The connection between the summer that did not come and the eruption of 1783 is an interpretation, a careful and compelling one, but an interpretation. The researchers themselves use the language of scientists who know the limits of their own reach. In their published work they did not claim to have proven the link. They wrote that they postulate it, that they propose it as the best available explanation for how these separate records, the wood, the history and the memory, might fit together. And later work has complicated even the science. Some researchers have questioned how much of the extreme cold of that specific season should be blamed on Laki at all, and how much on ordinary, if unlucky, swings in the natural climate system. The volcano may have been the whole story. It may have been only part of it. That debate is not settled, and pretending otherwise would be its own kind of dishonesty. So the pieces do not close into a locked box. What they do instead is something stranger, and in its way more haunting. They line up, a memory with no date, carried in a house at the edge of the continent. A ring of starved wood laid down in a single freezing summer. A veil of sulphur that a man in Paris watched dim the sun. 3 completely independent records, made by 3 completely different means, none of them aware of the others, all of them apparently pointing at the same wounded sky. And that raises a question that has nothing to do with volcanoes at all. It is a question about memory itself. Because if the interpretation is right, even partly, then the Kauwerak account is doing something remarkable. It is preserving, across generations, the trace of an event whose cause its people could not possibly have known. They never saw Iceland, they never saw the fissure or the lava or the rising gas. They had no way to understand that the reason their summer failed was a mountain bleeding fire 4,000 miles away. They could not record the cause, but they recorded the effect. They recorded the sky itself, which means the oral tradition was not functioning as an explanation. It was functioning as an instrument, a kind of human seismograph, registering the shock of a distant catastrophe with perfect fidelity to what was felt, even in total ignorance of what had struck. The Kauwerak did not know why the summer did not come. They only knew, and made certain their descendants would know, that it had not come, and what it had cost. How do you hold on to a single summer for that long? What kind of discipline of memory keeps one failed growing season alive and specific across a span of time long enough that the people carrying it forget the world that caused it? And why that summer, of all summers, in a place that has known many hard years, many cold springs, many lean and frightening winters? What made this one different enough to survive when the others were allowed to fade? Part of the answer lies in how the Kauwerak organized their own past. The summer that did not come was not remembered as one bad season among many. It was remembered as one of the 3 great disasters, a category, a fixed and deliberate structure of memory. The 3-day darkening of the sun, the flood, and the failed summer. These were not casual stories. They were the load-bearing beams of a people's understanding of what the world was capable of doing to them, and each one was preserved with the care that survival demands. To forget them was to be unprepared for their return. And here, carefully, on the side of memory rather than proof, some of the oldest ways of telling reach for something beyond the physical. According to how these accounts were understood, the failed summer was not merely weather. It was described as a time when the face of the sky itself had turned away, when the sun withdrew its warmth from the world, when the order that was supposed to govern the seasons had been broken by something the people could feel but not see. It is the language of the sacred applied to the meteorological, and it should not be mistaken for a scientific claim. But notice what it is doing. It is treating the dimming of the sun, the very thing Franklin measured with his burning glass, as the central fact worth remembering. The tradition and the ambassador, in their completely different tongues, both fixed on the same detail. The light had failed. Whether that understanding shaped how the memory was carried, whether framing the disaster as withdrawal of the sky helped fix it so permanently in the mind of a people, is something no record can confirm. But the structure it produced is real and documented. A specific catastrophe, filed under a specific category of the gravest events, wrapped in a way of telling that gave it the weight of the sacred, and passed forward, deliberately, generation after generation, until an old man on the Kauwerak River spoke it into a winter night in 1894, and eventually into a record that scientists 100 years later could set beside their trees. None of this proves that the summer that did not come was the summer of 1783. Oral tradition is a legitimate historical source, but like any source, it has to be weighed with care, not forced into a conclusion it never claimed to reach. What can be said is that the memory, the wood, and the fog all describe the same underlying thing: a summer, somewhere in the past, when the sun failed and the cold did not break, and people at the edge of the world paid for it with their lives. So return, for a moment, to that house on the river. An old man telling the winter stories the way they had always been told. A memory of a summer that never came, carried without a date across generations that could not have counted them. On the far side of an ocean, in the same year the trees would later point to, a bleeding fissure in Iceland throwing sulfur into the sky. And in Paris, a famous man holding a lens to a dimmed sun, watching it fail to burn a scrap of paper, reasoning his way toward a mountain he would never see. Is it a coincidence? It might be. A memory with no date is not a dated record, and no single piece of this evidence, taken alone, closes the distance between a sod house in Alaska and a fissure in Iceland. The skeptics have real points. The oral tradition names no year. The science of that particular season is still debated. Memory, however precise it feels, was never meant to function as a laboratory instrument. Those objections deserve to be taken seriously, and none of them has been fully resolved. But taken together, the pieces do something no single piece could do alone. They describe a shape, a summer that failed, a cause enormous enough to have caused it, and a memory carried across generations and finally written down that recorded the failing of the light with a fidelity that a burning glass in Paris would have recognized. We do not know, with the certainty the historical record would demand, that the Kauwerak were remembering Laki. That claim remains, and should remain, an open question rather than a conclusion. What we know is that a people at the far edge of a continent kept, for who knows how long, the memory of a sky that went wrong, and that the wood and the history and the volcano all seem to be looking up at the same wrong sky. If the memory truly reaches back to 1783, then it crossed more than 100 years to reach a page, and the event it records crossed an entire ocean to reach the people who first felt it. Two enormous distances, one of time and one of space, folded together into a single sentence spoken in a winter house. The summer did not come. The tree rings do not remember why. They only remember the cold, one starved line of wood among 400 fuller ones. Franklin never learned for certain what dimmed his sun. He guessed at a mountain and admitted he could not be sure. And the Kauwerak never knew that the thing that nearly ended them had a name, and a place, and a date on the other side of the world. Each of these three witnesses saw only a piece. None of them saw the whole, and yet laid side by side across a century and an ocean, they may be describing a single event from three completely different directions, none of them able to see the others, all of them telling the truth as far as they could feel it. Whether those three witnesses are connected the way the years seem to suggest, or whether the true answer still lies somewhere in the unglamorous churn of a natural climate that occasionally on its own steals a summer, remains a question that researchers continue to weigh and probably will for some time to come. Some interpretations here remain genuinely unresolved, and that is not a weakness in the story. It is the story. Thank you for watching. If documentaries like this one, built on physical evidence and indigenous oral tradition held to the same standard, are the kind of history you want more of, consider subscribing. And before you go, I want to ask you directly, if a people with no written calendar could carry the memory of a single failed summer across generations, faithfully enough that scientists a century later could set it beside their tree rings, then how many other true things are still being held, right now, in stories we have not yet learnt how to hear? I'll see you in the next documentary.